Did Joseph have a role in helping the Egyptians enslave the Hebrews? Let's begin a new series on the Ten Commandments and find out. The Ten Commandments are weirdly controversial. People argue about how they should be numbered when there's dozens of ways that people have numbered these things throughout history. Other people think it's really important that the Ten Commandments be displayed on government property in America and are willing to sue people who try to stop them. In fact, one mentally ill person made a sort of hobby out of destroying monuments of the Ten Commandments in 2 different states. He'd just drive into town and run them over with his car. So let's just say that our public conversation on the topic is lacking. People talk a lot about how important the commandments are, but they don't usually stop to talk about what they are, what they mean. In this series, we're going to go through each of the commandments, talk about what they mean for you and me today. In this video, we're going to cover the background, the story of where these laws come from. And in order to understand where these laws come from, we're going to have to talk about Egypt. Now, Egypt isn't just a place in the Bible, it's an archetype. Egypt has narrative significance. We're not talking about your friend from modern Egypt or anyone from modern Egypt. Egypt in the Bible often stands for a way of life. So when you see the word Egypt, it means something more to the reader than talking about the Hittites or the land of Nod.
Didn't steal the Nod ring, I swear to you. I meant, this is the truth. I meant to steal the Nod ring. I had planned to steal the Nod. There were 2 of them, so I planned to steal one of the Nod rings. And before I could steal the Nod ring, somebody stole the Nod rings, and it wasn't me.
Because the readers of Genesis knew all about Egypt and slavery and oppression, these early references to Egypt take on rich flavors. In Genesis 15, for instance, Abram is told that his children would someday be enslaved and oppressed. Abram doesn't know what country would do such a thing, but the readers of Genesis do because they know where this thing is going. Abram also has no kids in the story at this point, so his wife Sarai lets Abram sleep with her servant who is from, you guessed it, Egypt. Later, when Joseph's brothers want to get rid of him, they sell him to some traders who are going to, of course, Egypt. So really early on in the Bible, Egypt represents this kind of broken path for those who are trying to follow God. It's the way you're not supposed to go when you're following God. Now, Joseph did well in Egypt. We all know that. With his leadership, Pharaoh collected enough food during the 7 years of good harvest so that during the 7 years of bad harvest, his people would have enough to eat. But Genesis 37 records some dark undertones even in the Joseph story, because what happens after the Egyptians couldn't afford to buy food from Pharaoh? Well, they had to pay for their food, right? And when Pharaoh had all their money, Pharaoh took all their cattle. And when Pharaoh had all the money and all the cattle, Pharaoh took their land. And when he owned all the land, he bought the people. Joseph sold him the people. And when Pharaoh owns everybody and everything in Egypt, why can't he own other people? So Joseph dies, but his Hebrew family grows so much that the Egyptians come to fear them. What did Pharaoh do the last time he was afraid? He takes ownership of his people. What will this Pharaoh do when he's afraid? He takes ownership of his people. Joseph's people, the Hebrew people. Now, as I said, Egypt is more than a place. It's an idea, it's a theology. Exodus begins with the Egyptians oppressing the Hebrews. But a huge turning point in the life of Moses is when he sees a Hebrew beating another Hebrew. And the undertone in this story is very clear. God's people have become Egyptianized. So, what does this have to do with the Ten Commandments? The Egypt story is the context for everything else that follows at Mount Sinai, where all of these laws are given. And they are given to de-Egyptianize the people, to teach them a better way to live and be reconciled with their Creator. For example, over and over in the law, it says things like, do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. The message is clear. Don't be like Egypt and enslave foreigners just because they're not like you. Laws like these also show you how important empathy is. When you see a foreigner, remember that you once were a foreigner, so treat them better than you were treated. Or take the laws of Jubilee. It was a common practice in the ancient world to sell yourself to pay off a debt, kind of how we all wish we could do with our student loans. But the Hebrews didn't sell themselves to the Egyptians. The Egyptians forced them into servitude. And they weren't slaves for a specific amount of time until the debt was paid. They were slaves forever. So even though Joseph saved the Egyptians, Pharaoh's message was essentially, you owe me so much you'll have to work forever and ever and ever and never be able to pay me back. And that is, by the way, why I don't think Joseph had a hand in enslaving the Hebrews. He bought the Egyptians for Pharaoh in Genesis, but that was the common practice of the day, to pay off a debt so they could have food, so they could survive. Pharaoh, on the other hand, enslaved the Hebrew people forever, and that was only possible after he had forgotten what Joseph had done for him. So he didn't have that same lesson of empathy which the laws at Sinai will later try to instill in the Hebrews. Some of the first laws God gives after the Ten Commandments are about slavery. Big surprise, right? And God says that any Hebrew who has sold himself into slavery to pay off a debt is to be offered his freedom after 6 years. Now, in the version of this law written in Deuteronomy, God is even clearer. When you set your slaves free, don't make them go empty-handed. Send them out generously. The text says, as the Lord your God has blessed you, you must give to them. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. There's that empathy again. Now, these laws, including the Ten Commandments, didn't appear in a vacuum. They appear as an antidote to Egypt. So the Ten Commandments begin. I, the Lord, am your God who brought you from the land of Egypt, from the house of slavery. These 10 commandments aren't the dictates of some distant deity. They're the medicine given by somebody who just rescued you from slavery and is now trying to nurse you back to health. Maybe this is why King David says things like, oh, how I love your law, I meditate on it all day long. Roy Gain, prominent Old Testament scholar, recently wrote that studying the law is not an end in itself. Rather, it serves the purpose of moral character development. When God's people follow his righteous instruction within the context of his intimate covenant relationship with them, they may become wise in the way they live, so that others are drawn to him and his ways. They serve as a channel of true wisdom and blessing for the world. So, our focus in studying the Ten Commandments is to see what wisdom we can learn for living in the 21st century, or whatever century you're in right now. I'm not judging. The word commandment or law often gives us the wrong impression. I mean, the Jews have long understood that these laws that we find in the Old Testament, including the Ten Commandments, are really describing a path, a way of life, rather than just some random rules. And as we study, please don't forget the context, that these laws were given as a way of life, as an antidote to this broken Egyptian way of living. So maybe there's something here to learn to help us on our spiritual journey. So that means that the best is yet to come. This is Matthew with Peoria Adventist saying, see you next time.